This podcast is based on race, ethnicity, and differentiating between both, and understanding race and its impact in the year 2020. We've seen multiple cases in the news, so I thought it would be great if we just broke it down into something that people could understand and maybe have a different perspective on. Understanding race and ethnicity and breaking it down for the year 2020. Race in humans was an idea that originated from science. Scientists back in the day were using it to divide, or first of all, to understand species of plants and animals. It eventually expanded into the human realm where different, ethnic groups were being broken into so-called races like African American, Asian, Native American. All of these were broken down into races. However, race is a social construct, meaning it is something that was man-made. It's not an accurate portrayal of understanding biological differences in humans. Um, so physical traits that are different from, say you're Hispanic and you have a certain physical trait, but then you're African American and you have a certain physical trait like your hair, this isn't identified by your so-called race. This is identified by your adaptation to your area, to your genes, to your region, to your geographical area, stuff like that. So when we look at ethnicity, ethnicity is defined as an individual's identification and what an individual may share with a particular group, such as culture, language, music, stories. When using ethnicity, traits are taught and are not inherited. So, when you think about ethnicity, you think about common languages. So Athabascan speakers, that's a Native American language also found in Alaska and I think parts of Mongolia as well. You think about French Creole, they share common traits in food, culture, and their history. You think about Chinese Americans and their common traits, their history, how they migrated here, what was some of the reasons they were brought here, different things that identify ethnic groups. So not necessarily biological traits. These are more cultural traits that are shared. An individual may choose to still identify as Black, Hispanic, or Asian, but this would not be because they're shared traits of the culture. It would be so it wouldn't be because of their biological traits. It would be because of their shared traits that they have with the culture or how they feel. So technically, there's been an article that was published that says you don't have to be biologically Indian. You could be culturally Indian. So you might not be born into it biologically, but if you really adapt into the culture, then you could identify as Native American or American Indian. So what does race mean in the year 2020? Race in 2020. So to understand race, we need to understand that the concept of the miner's canary. The miner's canary is the idea that if the canary dies, then the miner is bound to die as well. So in real time, this would mean that minority communities like Native communities and Hispanic communities are the canary. Whatever happens to their communities is bound to happen in mainstream communities or the general public of the United States. And this isn't just strictly bound to Hispanic or Native communities. This is just an example. This could be any minority community that's having some type of issue. I just chose to use this one because I'm most familiar with it. So applying this concept in 2020 from a medical anthropological perspective, we need to look at minority communities. One of the communities that was affected disproportionately by COVID-19 was the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation had reported cases skyrocketing, had reported people dying, people not getting enough adequate health care, and this was because of the fault lines of healthcare in the U.S. So, if the Navajo Nation falls, this is the miner, right? This is the canary. So if the Navajo Nation falls, they're you're bound to see the same thing in the mainstream society. Mainstream society would be the miner. Navajo Nation is the canary. So, the Navajo Nation had only a certain amount of resources available and PPE. As a result, the attack rate has been high and the fatality rate has been high as well. This is the canary. If we look at a mainstream population and examine Houston, so not a native community but a city within Texas, we see that the cases began to skyrocket and hospitals reached capacity as well as the morgues. Houston is the minor. So what happened to the Navajo Nations began happening to Houston. Race in 2020 means that while it is a social construct, it has created a precedent of what can be expected. If minority communities suffer like the Navajo, eventually the general public will collapse just like the canary. And so another example of this could be seen with the some of the minority communities that are suffering with lack of PPE, lack of personal protective equipment. If they don't receive enough personal protective equipment because there's not enough to go around, other major cities like Seattle or New York or Maryland may be prone to the same issue. So you want to make sure that you always watch minority communities that aren't as endowed as their counterparts. These communities often reflect what is going to happen in mainstream society. What does it mean to be colorblind? So a lot of people think that being colorblind basically gets rid of the idea of racism. So if I'm colorblind, I'm not racist. It actually kind of has a different meaning nowadays when you think about it. Colorblind racism was an idea that emerged and gained rapid support amongst mainstream society of America. To be colorblind means that an individual chooses not to see color and believes that there are no racial inequalities or injustices occurring. However, being colorblind also turns a blind eye to racial inequalities and supports societal standards that may only empower one ethnic group in particular. So this might be the ethnic group in a certain community that might have more power over another ethnic group, things like that. So if you're saying you're colorblind, you're not necessarily making the situation better. It sometimes makes the situation a little bit worse. So you just want to be aware of what it means to be colorblind in times like these. Colorblind racism should not be a standard. To change this, people of all ethnic backgrounds should be aware of the history of a nation, acknowledge its flaws, and look to improve what can be done for people who have been treated wrongly or persecuted. There's also the idea that you know, the minority communities are growing in the United States, which is great. And there's such thing as reverse racism, and so we also want to be cognizant of that. We don't want to necessarily reflect that back onto a group that might have more or less, right? But we do want to make sure that we're being equal with one another. In 2020, being colorblind is to be ignorant. Race is a social construct which has created several types of precedents which should not be a standard. To fight the idea of being colorblind, race needs to be understood as only a social construct, nothing that defines the biological features of an individual. So in order to debunk race and everything that surrounds it, especially in times like these, it's good to have a good understanding of what exactly race was determined by in the first place. So race was determined by people with different skin colors, people with different hair colors, eye color, um, different traits, physical traits specifically. So race is not a product of your biological feature. Race, again, is a social construct. So to debunk this, it's good to understand that skin color comes from the location that you're at. So say you live below the equator, more than likely your skin's a little darker than if you live farther away from the equator. If you live somewhere close to the equator but not below the equator, your skin's probably a little tan. If you live far, far away from the equator, you're probably a little lighter skinned. The same thing being said, if the sun is not showing as much above the equator, you probably have lighter hair color, lighter skin color, and different texture for your hair, right? But if you live right with the equator or right below the equator, you probably have more matty hair, more darker skin color, more melon, but this is just a result of the sun shining down. So this is an adaptation that occurs in order to ensure the idea of survival. So going back to the idea of survival of the fittest, which I'll get into the next podcast. But really, this is just a rundown of how to debunk race. So if an individual moves from an area with less sun to an area with little sun, the skin may possibly lighten. Again, this is an adaptation that occurs. Humans are able to adapt to their environment. This does not define a race as a matter of fact. It only establishes ethnic identity of an individual. Physical traits may change, but cultural traits may remain intact and evolve as the individual establishes identity for themselves. And it's also important to note when talking about culture and ethnic groups, culture is fluid. It's never consistent. If you move from one city that you're used to, but you move to another city and you pick up their habits and their customs, you've already adapted to that city's customs as well. So that's just another thing. So really, race isn't real. You can move from one place to another and it will never stay constant. You will always be in a different ethnic group and you will always be accultured to different things. Unless you choose to stay in a hometown or you choose to stay in one area that you're familiar with, you might not be as exposed to that. But it's important to remember that culture is fluid, race is a social construct, and physical traits do change over time because we are adaptable to our surroundings and geographical areas wherever we choose to land. So now to understand the term ethnicity itself. Ethnicity is fluid. An individual may share the same religion, ideology, beliefs, language, and celebrations. This creates a culture that an individual may identify with. It is possible to be biologically white but culturally Native American. There have been cases where a white boy or girl was adopted by a tribe. These individuals became acculturated in the native culture. As a result, they saw themselves as Native American versus white. Ethnicity is fluid, so your identity, the way you choose to identify, is always changing. You may look biologically in a certain manner, in a certain way, but you may identify with different cultural practices. Race is not real. It is only used to define physical and biological traits. It is not real. Ethnicity attempts to capture the culture of an individual or group. Ethnicity also creates more self-identification and allows for an individual to self-identify as they believe, as they see fit. So again, people who have certain cultural traits, share the same food, share the same language, share the same music, share the same folklore, stuff like that. Ethnicity in 2020 needs to be used more so that there's more cultural competence and understanding of what it means to be American and the diversity within America. So in America, there are tons of groups that are together that live in the United States, which has created the beauty of America. Um, you know, ethnicity is considered to be a cultural identity. It can sometimes be determined by the manner of dressing, and members of one ethnicity can join another ethnicity. So this isn't to promote changing race or changing what you identify as. This is just for people to understand that race isn't the right word to use. If you were to understand ethnicity and what exactly it means, it could probably help save us a lot of time and a lot of things that are going on in the news lately in 2020. Um, I guess in conclusion, ethnicity should be what we focus on. It shouldn't take away, ethnicity shouldn't focus on the physical, biological traits. It should focus really on the cultural traits of how someone behaves, how someone interacts with another person, how they interact with people within their own group. Things should just be cognizant of, really. So, overall, applying what we learned and how it relates in 2020. The term race was used by scientists to denote various species of plants and animals and was then transitioned into the human population. In 2020, we should be cognizant of the terms we use. Instead of race, we can use different terms such as populations, different cultures, different ethnic groups. This helps to embrace the differences not just in humans, but helps us to understand the cultures we are surrounded by. In 2020, we should strive to be more cognizant of each other's differences, but also embrace the differences that help to create the nation we live in. By understanding each other's differences, but also, and the cultures, I think this would prevent a lot of things that are happening in the news, like the police brutality, lack of cultural competence, um, and being cognizant overall of race, how it affects us. If we were to eliminate that term and really just embrace the fact that people come from different areas, different migration stories, and we look at the history of the U.S., I think we'd have a lot better understanding of why we are where we're at, and why we have so many cultures within the United States. So that concludes this podcast. Thank you for listening, and please like it.